First of all, I would like to thank you for being here this weekend, and I would like to thank all the speakers who have dedicated some of their time to share their insights with us today. It is an honor for me and a pleasure to be involved in all this memorable weekend we have had. Memorable in two ways. Not only this year's memorial lecture, again in honor of the late John Wernham, but also a very important historical event which I've chosen to be part of, so I better not spoil it now. We have experienced osteopathic history being brought back to us, to London, almost 100 years since or after John Martin Littlejohn came over from the United States to England to embark with probably the longest of his journeys, the teaching of the principles of what he called the greatest breakthrough in medicine, namely osteopathy. Over the last day and a half, you have had the opportunity to observe osteopathic history being presented in probably the finest and most detailed form, thanks to Jason. We have seen Jamie Archer elaborating, displaying, and demonstrating to us the oldest forms of early osteopathic technique, as applied by A.T. Still. Terence Singe has given us an idea and a background of the environment of early English osteopathic pioneers in close relationship to Littlejohn. We have also had the opportunity to hear the great Professor Patterson giving us his valuable insights and experiences in the field of osteopathic research. Thank you. I would like to thank our colleagues from Italy, the Associazione Italiana dell'Osteopatia Classica, for their dedication and commitment to continue the work of the teachings of Still, Littlejohn and Wernham. Grazie. I would like to thank Valerie Taylor for sharing and contributing her experiences of the commemoration of John Wernham. Finally, I would like, where is that thing gone? Finally, I would like to present you a few snapshots of some historical and biographical information by probably the two greatest teachers of the osteopathic principles in England, John Martin Littlejohn and John Wernham. I hope I can draw your attention for another 40 minutes. So history again, but I promise you osteopathic history is far more exciting. And if I may quote John Wernham at this point, if we do not know our history, we do not know where we're going. So simple that statement, but so profound, and therefore worth spending a little time on it. On the right picture you see on the screen is of two great pioneers of our osteopathic profession in Europe, whose names you will be familiar by now. These men in actual fact need little introduction. It is more my person which requires one. My name is Francisco Toscano. Oops. Right. Okay, and I must say Maidstone has been a very special place for me all the way through my studies and career, and I must thank Mr. Wernham, then because without him I would not be standing here with you today. I'm here providing you with a sample of Littlejohn's and Wernham's biographies in osteopathic philosophy. Over the years working in Maidstone and having had the opportunity to see the great John Wernham in action in the classroom and with his patient, one thing became very clear to me. What was it, you might think? It was the passion, the true commitment he had to the osteopathic profession and to the principles and studies of his mentor John Martin Littlejohn, which he continued in practice very closely all the way to his last treatments, few weeks before him passing away at the age of 99 in 2007. These observations were strong enough to create the desire to start commemorating these pioneers of the osteopathic profession and offer their contribution in literature to as many other possible osteopaths and students as possible. When we look at this literature, it spans over 100 years between the works of Littlejohn and Wernham, exactly 109 years, from 1898 to 2007. Imagine all the experience and knowledge accumulated there by two great osteopathic minds. When I first got started with our literature back in our library in Maidstone, it saddened me to see so many books, so much information and experience acquired over a century sitting there on the shelves. And I think Professor Patterson's picture with Mr. Wernham in front of the shelf, I really like that picture. I will ask you for a copy. Thank you. This was a key moment for the JWCCO, and we embarked on our international travels that has taken us throughout Europe in the last 4 years. So let us come back and talk about Littlejohn, and remember and not forget the role he had in expanding osteopathy in England and in the rest of Europe. I would call him therefore the European father of osteopathy, and you will find out why along the course of the presentation. First of all, I would like to give you a little background information about these two remarkable osteopaths which left a mark in the development of osteopathy in England. My idea is to run you through and present you with the basic concepts of Littlejohn's osteopathic philosophy. My intent is to invite you to have a look at how Littlejohn and Wernham understood the application of our osteopathic principles, and to get an insight into what scope osteopathy had for them. So, first of all, let me start with John Wernham. Who was he and what meant osteopathy to him? John Wernham was born the 2nd of May 1907 and passed away on the 9th of February 2007, very shortly of his 100th birthday. He was first introduced to John Martin Littlejohn in 1915 at the young age of 8, when he, together with the Littlejohn boys, played cricket at the back garden of their house. Very English, you might think, but true it is. John Wernham began his working career in Fleet Street as a photojournalist, but was interrupted at the invitation of Littlejohn to study osteopathy in 1928. This tempting invitation from the family friend to embark on the osteopathic journey was the beginning of what became a long and close relationship. Littlejohn became a highly respected friend, teacher, colleague and mentor for John Wernham. From that time onwards, for over 70 years, John Wernham studied, followed, lectured, practiced and published in accordance to Littlejohn's teachings. Osteopathic life was interrupted between 1939 and 1945 when he served as a war photographer throughout Africa and many other places. Sergeant Wernham, also known as the Prof, never stopped thinking osteopathy, even during that time. In the last years, the college has been approached by families who experienced having osteopathic care from him during his time in Africa. So providing us with further information about how he probably pioneered and promoted the osteopathic principles throughout the African continent. Quite fascinating for me, I think. It was in 1947 when he first brought osteopathy to Maidstone, and it was in 1952 that he founded the clinic many of our European colleagues associated him with. Mr. Wernham was an important instigator of what is now known the European School of Osteopathy, due to his initiative and support in the late 1960s and 70s. In 1985, John Wernham founded the Maidstone College of Osteopathy, devoted to the teachings of Dr. John Martin Littlejohn. The college was renamed the John Wernham College of Classical Osteopathy in 1996 in honor of him. Over the years, John Wernham wrote and published a considerable library of osteopathic texts dealing with the principles, technique and practice as they were laid down by John Littlejohn. John Wernham was probably one of the best interpreters of Littlejohn mechanics, developing and providing us with a set of illustrations and mechanical charts we use and come across sometimes in some of the current osteopathic literature. As we see, polygon of forces, these charts, you all know. He practiced and taught up to the time of his demise. This weekend is in honor of him and to the dedication of his life, osteopathy. His college continues his work at Legacy through the clinic, postgraduate courses and publishing of classical osteopathic texts. So, what did John Wernham have to say about Littlejohn? Wernham described Littlejohn as a softly spoken, gentle, kind man who disliked any arguments and debates. He continued describing him how beyond his calm exterior and frail physical body there was an immense intellect and scholarship. Littlejohn's upbringing was marked by poverty and hard work, and Wernham described parallels to A.T. Still on the other side of the Atlantic. It was said about Littlejohn that he sailed to America as a dying man and was restored to health at the hands of A.T. Still. In response to his restored health, he became a true follower of what he called the greatest breakthrough in medicine. It was him who looked at osteopathy beyond anatomy and who introduced the depth of physiology to it. It has been told about Littlejohn that he took A.T. Still's osteopathy and against much opposition dipped it well and truly in a bath of physiology. And what was more, he kept it there. He created interrelationships between the visible and the invisible, the tangible and the untangible. The supreme scholarship and profundity of his work did not render Littlejohn popular at times. You may wonder why. At the same time, some of his contemporaries described him being 30 years ahead of his time. So academic compatibility might have been a reason, maybe, who knows. When Littlejohn left Kirksville to begin what became the hurricane years in Chicago, Fryette remarked that he had taken the brains from Kirksville, with all his respects to the ASO. From 1900 to 1912, during the time in Chicago, he gave an enormous contribution to the research of osteopathy. Who was John Littlejohn? He was born in Glasgow in 1865 and married in 1900 in England and had a total of 6 children. Littlejohn graduated from the University of Glasgow, where he obtained degrees in theology, arts, divinity and law. Between the years of 1885 and 1889, he devoted the study of anatomy and physiology at Kelvin Hall under the eminent Scottish physiologist Dr. McKendrick. In 1892, he was awarded the Hunter Gold Medal in Forensic Medicine, and that same year he sets off to the USA. In America, he studied medicine, political philosophy, economy, and finance at the Columbia University. It is believed he first met A.T. Still for personal medical reasons in 1897, and shortly after was invited to give a lecture on physiology at the American School of Osteopathy. Within that year, he enrolls as a student. In 1898, he is appointed Dean of the Faculty because of his academic background and experience, and occupies the position of Professor of Physiology, Psychology and Psychiatry, and Dean of the Faculty of the American School of Osteopathy. In July 1898, he introduced osteopathy to Europe for the first time, being invited to give a lecture at the Society of Science, Letters and Arts. The title of the lecture was Osteopathy in Line with Apostolic Succession with Medicine. A second lecture was delivered the following year, 1899. The same year, he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in Great Britain. In 1898–99, he writes a 900-page textbook on physiology, and a publication of the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association praises it as the highest type of scientific osteopathic literature, and it attracts the attention of other branches of the medical profession, both in the United States and in Europe. During that time, a series of lectures are published. On the 17th of July 1900, he gave his third lecture to the Royal Society. The title of that lecture was A New View of the Science of Therapeutics. Following his time in Kirksville, he established the Littlejohn College of Osteopathy and Hospital in Chicago in 1900, where he taught and practiced until 1913. In 1901, Littlejohn publishes the first scientific article in the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association titled Osteopathy, an Independent System Coextensive with the Science and Art of Healing. In 1903, Littlejohn is on his travels through France and Germany, visiting the major medical institutions of that time. In 1907, the book The Principle of Osteopathy and the Theory and Practice of Osteopathic Therapeutics are printed and published. In 1908, Littlejohn and C.A. Whiting research on neoplasms for the A.T. Still Research Institute of the American Osteopathic Association. Around 1915, he returns to Britain, where he establishes in 1917 the British School of Osteopathy. Here we have a list of all his published material. The list continues, and there is much more unpublished Littlejohn lectures sitting on our shelves, ready to be printed and published one day. So watch out for them. So there is no doubt about what intellectual capacity he was and the great professional status he had within the greats and early pioneers of osteopathy. He settled in England and started up the British School of Osteopathy during the First World War. He continued his osteopathic commitments and studies even through the Second World War. He always continued to battle through all the difficult times during his lives, even from the own profession, with only one thing in mind: to pass on what he called the greatest breakthrough in medicine. Reading through the lecture notes and scripts of Littlejohn, it seemed that he never stopped working and thinking osteopathy, even through these difficult times. A series of unpublished work and lecture notes were created, and the principles of osteopathy further elaborated and refined, thus providing us today a rich osteopathic heritage. At this point, I have to mention John Wernham, or JW, or Big John, how many students, colleagues, osteopaths and friends used to call him. It was mainly him, with some help from other colleagues, who continued to teach and practice osteopathy the way Littlejohn had taught them after his death in 1947. May I respectfully emphasize the 60 years of osteopathic life Mr. Wernham spent after the death of Littlejohn in 1947. Over 70 years of true loyal commitment to the osteopathic principles Andrew Taylor still had laid out and Littlejohn elaborated. He kept alive the works and spirit of Littlejohn during the times where there was little acknowledgement from followers of the profession, even from the graduates of the school he once set up in 1917. In the last few years, we have experienced a turnaround and many more students and colleagues rediscovering the great work Littlejohn had provided us. The growing interest reflects the importance and depth of his work. So my thank you to him for the osteopathic genius he was. So do not take my words, but find out for yourselves. It's worth it. Here we have a few Littlejohn quotes just to get a little flavor. Physiology, he said, is the gateway through which we may enter the great field of osteopathic philosophy, technique and practice. The science and systems of therapeutics we call osteopathy constitutes the application of the physical treatment for conversion into a physiological process within the body. That's a mechanical-physiological relationship, very important. It will always come across that in our text or in our presentations. If you look here, pharmacology takes the human body and analyzes it from the chemical side, but we take the human body and make it our own pharmacology. That is to say, the human body is inherently its own master chemist, producing all the chemicals necessary for energy and the stimulation of vitality. And the way he viewed the spine and the way he treated the spine, it's apparent when we hear these lines where he describes the spine as being a coordinating center rather than a corrective one. And a line very characterized Littlejohn is that when he said always, you cannot adjust the abnormal to the normal. So his conception of the osteopathic lesion was not a bone being out of place. So it was a rather wider, greater field of disturbances which played a part. He views osteopathy beyond of just being just a manipulative technique and describes it as a biological science. He gives osteopathy an independent identity from medicine, especially when we look at this statement. So the independent identity, osteopathic identity, independent from the medics. Here in this diagram we see Littlejohn's trinity, the integrative operations of the chemical, physical and vital forces, representing the columns of expression of health of the body. This provides us with the perspective of the human body that views the body beyond of just a set of structures and functions, but as an integrated system in direct relationship between its internal and external environment. The human body represents a mirror image of the constant correlation of structure and function in the continuum of health. As Littlejohn considered osteopathy as a biological science. He thought of osteopathy as a system of therapeutics that was based on the application of the sciences of physiology, anatomy and mechanics to the body. When he looked at osteopathy, he encouraged to make use of all the sciences as they were there, but without leaving out the principles. Otherwise we are gone, he used to say. Therefore stressing again the importance of osteopathically orientated research, that is research based on the principles of osteopathy as fundamental guidelines. Professor Patterson has given us guidelines to follow and emphasized this morning. As by Littlejohn's principles, if we study disease from the standpoint of the body itself, its makeup, capacity and function, rather than introduce foreign substances in the hope of palliating its disabilities, we would be more likely to succeed. This is so, he said, because we are allowing the body to function as a biological mechanism in its natural way. As A.T. Still stated, that in order to allow the innate physiological process to run freely, all drugs ought to be discarded and nothing should be introduced into the body which was foreign to its composition. Of course, there were and are exceptions, but in general the etiology of disease was based on the concept of anatomical alterations and functional disturbances interfering with articular and reflex activity. Consequently, the treatment was orientated to address the causes of dysfunction rather than the symptoms. The existence of a biological organism is comparable with an individual, self-sustaining and self-reparative vital organism that acts in reciprocal relationship with its external environment. So, how do we link the biology into our osteopathic thinking? So let us have a look to the principles behind the osteopathic thinking. Littlejohn's concept of osteopathy emphasized that the underlying principle of osteopathy is expressed in the words mechanical organic adjustment. The fields of adjustment being the structural, functional and environmental aspects of the living organism. This principle is applied as a universal law, as the body as a biological organism furnishes the innate capacity of auto-regulation and self-reparative ability. It is therefore that osteopathy acts as a facilitating system or science or feeling that uses the natural resources and capacities of the body as a means in order to adjust the affected conditions. Osteopathy takes its stance on the principle that the etiology of disease is to trace to the abnormal adjustment of the anatomical, physiological and environmental condition of the organism. And therefore, in order to help with the dysfunction, the cause or causes must be removed and the parameters of the structure, function and environment readjusted in order to provide for homeostatic balance. The body is a vital mechanism, we have heard before, or even better, a biological organism. And osteopathy aims to further and promote cooperation and harmony of all the bodily function in order to provide best possible conditions for healthy function. The basis of all vital functions in the body is the blood circulation and the nerve force action. Littlejohn includes lymph function as a very important part of the circulating system, and therefore emphasizes the importance of the physiological parameters of blood, lymph and nerves as a desirable treatment outcome. At the same time, the replenishing interaction of the blood through the field of nutrition and the elimination process of the body becomes an important body function to consider and support in the treatment as well. This conception as the body is a vital mechanism implies that every part of the organism is supplied with circulating blood and nerve force. And these are the two balancing functions in the body which are used as a corrective means in osteopathic treatment. The physiological effects of free circulating arterial blood and nerve force are a basis of osteopathic thinking. This may remind you of the rule of the artery supreme, of course, our first grade principles we read in the books, but do we apply it always? We can also read Littlejohn talking about unobstructive nerve force. In other words, in modern terminology, axoplasmic flow. This is a highly researched topic these days, but remember Littlejohn thought and talked about its importance over 100 years ago. Old books, no way, John Wernham used to say. Lately, at an osteopathic conference in Rome earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak to a very fascinating man, a leading researcher and one of the highest authorities in the world in the field of autonomic nervous system. His eyes lit up when the name Sherrington came into play. He described this book as an amazing and unbelievable to have found this book in an antique bookshop in Cambridge, sometimes in the 1960s. So it's a book which is far away from the book lists of the osteopathic students these days. The old literature may lack the colorful and fancy illustrations, but will provide with an insight and quality of content which can stand par with the textbooks in our schools today. So Littlejohn was on the right track, you may think. John Wernham always said, osteopathy has got its own language and its own pathology. Let me introduce the basic concepts of the osteopathic pathology in those days. The pathology of the allopathic medical schools is the pathology of the morbid anatomy. Osteopathic pathology, in contrary, is the pathology of physiological disorder. That is, before there are any known morbid anatomical changes. We always find altered function. Both are equally valid, but of course are expressing different things at the same time. All cases of disease where there is a pathological condition start out either in an exaggeration or reduction of physiological activity, caused by some obstructive or irritative conditions in the body. Any factors interrupting the homeostatic balance of the body will lead to abnormal reactions, creating altered functional activities. It is when this perverted function persists over long periods of time that the tissues result with morbid changes. These changes taking place in the tissues when their physiological parameters have been driven out to extremes, so that normal function has been extremely compromised and unable to obtain. These morbid changes have been called pathologically, but they are really morbid anatomy. The true pathology is the pathology of the abnormal reaction. The osteopathic pathology is an obstructive or irritative condition that results initially in disturbed function. These results ultimately establish interferences in vasomotion and nerve supply to the various tissues and organs of the body, consequently lowering its vitality and increasing its susceptibility to germ invasion through the changes of the internal environment. This again reminds us of A.T. Still's first great principle, the rule of the artery supreme, emphasizing the free flow of blood as the best known germicide. The basis of osteopathic pathology is in the changes of vasomotion, lymphomotion and visceral motion through alteration of the reflex activities. In this diagram we see and observe the continuum of health from function to dysfunction, this ease state, the state of functional disorder. That's osteopathic pathology. That's where the patients we see before there are any organic changes visible in the x-rays, etc. So that's where the osteopathy is at its strongest, as John Wernham used to say. Having had a brief look at what the early osteopaths considered as the osteopathic pathology, leads us to the next point. What is then the osteopathic lesion? The osteopathic lesion is not to be regarded as a malformation or even a maladjustment of vertebra, but as a mechanico-physiological interruption or suspension of the physical body via the heart and soft tissues, the fluids and nerves, the posture, the toxemia, together with all the hazards which are subjected to our environment. All play a role and express themselves through the body. That is to say that the lesion is a physiologically and not a pure anatomical condition. And every lesion in the body is vital and stands in a relationship to the vitality of the patient. This very reason highlights that the correction of the bony lesion is difficult to maintain if the underlying physiology is not addressed at the same time. Healthy tissue is tissue in which there is correlation between blood circulation and nerve force. In the osteopathic lesion we find unhealthy tissue, which shows a condition at which all associated mobility and motility of fluids and tissues are altered. There seems to be an an interference of function, creating obstruction and irritation to the nerve force and blood supply. Observe the reciprocal relationship in terms of the microcirculation of these vital tissues. The health of nerve activity is dependent upon the blood supply, and the blood is dependent on the nerve activity, emphasizing the importance of the unobstructed supply of the vasa nervorum and nervio vasorum in order to maintain optimal function. And therefore, any abnormal condition or alteration of tissues, such as bones, muscle, ligaments, will interfere with the flow of these vital fluids and nerve forces and produce a congested or obstructive condition state. These conditions that we find in connection with lesions always involve the nerve and blood supply to a lesser or greater extent, therefore making no dividing line between the etiology and the pathology. The obstructive or irritative condition is responsible directly for the underlying inflammatory condition which plays an important role in the tissue disturbance of our osteopathic pathology. The concept of what the osteopathic lesion was about offered a different and wider perspective to the somatic dysfunction we teach in the schools these days. It becomes apparent how complex the nature of the osteopathic lesion is. It is not just an abnormal position of a bone or segment, but a whole array of mechanical lesion patterns and disturbances in neurological and muscular fields which needs consideration. All the findings are correlated to the spine, and all associated signs and symptoms part of what is going on with the patient on a structural and functional level and vital level. It is therefore that the popular quick manipulation of a particular articulation is very unlikely to adjust all these previously mentioned altered physiological processes which are running their course. It was therefore that a more appropriate method was considered in order to address and adjust all these physiological levels. As Littlejohn said, in correction, it is not sufficient to thrust or force a vertebra into line. It is essential to remember that we must rectify the whole gravity line before we can adjust the local lesion or keep it adjusted. This means that the osteopathic lesion is not merely a maladjusted vertebra, series of vertebra or soft tissues, but that it is a disturbance which plays against the force and line of gravity and gravitational points in the spine and body. Littlejohn reminds us that the spine is a coordinating center, not a corrective one. The spine acts as an interface between the structure and the physiology of the body. So after taking you through various steps of Littlejohn's thinking, we might build building blocks for a definition. Nevertheless, I may add, before we go to Littlejohn's definition, a quote by Dane Tasker about the problem to define osteopathy. Many definitions, he said, have been formulated and published to the world. Each one tends to limit one's conception of osteopathy in some particular way. A definition always limits the thing defined. Therefore, no definition of osteopathy can be complete because we are dealing with a principle, the universality of which no one knows. Let us now move on to Littlejohn's attempt to provide us with the understanding of osteopathy. This is the definition which was published in 1900 in the journal The Science of Osteopathy, and one which Dane Tasker himself lists in his comprehensive book, The Principle of Osteopathy of 1913. A quote read, Osteopathy is that science or system of feeling which emphasizes the diagnosis of disease by physical methods with a view to discovering not symptoms, but the causes of disease, in connection with misplacements of tissue, obstruction of fluids, and interferences with the nutritive resources and forces of the organism. Secondly, the treatment of disease by scientific manipulation, in connection with which the operating physician mechanically uses and applies the inherent resources of the organism to overcome disease and establish health, either by removing or correcting mechanical disorders and thus permitting nature to recuperate the diseased part, or by producing and establishing antitoxic and septic condition of the organism or its parts, and supplying and regulating the nutritive supplies. There's a third part, but I thought I may leave it out because enough to struggle with these two paragraphs. So, quite some definition. Nowadays we seem to have moved away slightly from this type of thinking, haven't we? Actually, we have reduced and confined ourselves to operate on the musculoskeletal system predominantly according to the official definitions which represent us in public. May I at this point provide you with a quote by Dr. Hewlett in Osteopathy, Not Only a Method. I quote, "We must guard against this error in osteopathy," he said. Dr. Hewlett emphasizes this when he speaks of the fatal mistake of making osteopathy synonymous with the manipulative removal of lesion. Here we dignify method and means by putting the method in place of that principle which is a law of nature. This overzealous misapprehension of the osteopath has given scope to the false view of osteopathy so generally entertained by the medical fraternity, that it is simply rubbing or correcting lesions or manipulating in some way or other. Correction or manipulation is all there is to the science according to this view. No, he says. We are here making the same mistake that we charge to the rest of this medical profession, that it is putting effect in the place of the cause, neglecting etiology while emphasizing incidental or accidental signs of an inherent condition, emphasizing the method and overlooking the principle which is of first importance. Osteopathy rests on the proposition that the reparative and curative forces are in the protective functional activities of the body itself, and that the end of therapeutics is the removal of conditions disturbing the free operations. The principles of adjustment. This is the system of treatment as practiced by Littlejohn, which was entirely opposed to the direct attack on the afflicted area of the body, but was directed to the integration of the body, which meant commencing treatment at the furthermost point of the region of distress. Littlejohn considered pain as being symptomatic of disorder, and it is of little value to extinguish the body's appeal for help without attempting to get way behind it, as he used to say, or causa causans, in other words, starting the journey of discovery of the underlying cause of the presenting symptoms. Osteopathic adjustment is a matter of integration. The integration of vasomotion, lymphomotion, and visceral motion function via the access of the physiological centers and the mechanical adjustment in regards to the forces acting upon the body. The adjustment of the body is mild in its execution. It prepares and activates the body tissues, restores body alignment, relieves the eccentric stress factors, removes obstruction to the fluids and forces of the body, and gives unity to the disordered body. Local treatment was thought to loosen and free the structures, but would be considered of little value if they were not correlated to each other and integrated to the overall needs of the body. It is for this reason that specific local treatment fails to stabilize the body and is soon made the victim of the body vitality. These ideas suggest that although osteopathy is mechanistic in outlook and deals with the visible body in the most practical terms, we must remember that mechanical forces and biological reaction lie beyond those things we can touch and see. Here a few quotes, just first one quite good. Osteopathy carries us back to nature, to the body processes, to the body vitalities and the physiological causes, physiological conditions and physiological functions, and all these not upon mysticisms we have based and still base our theory of osteopathy. That last one is quite good as well, I like them. Osteopathy is a system of medicine using the word medicine not to indicate drugs, but to indicate the science and art of treating diseases or injuries and the laws that regulate their practice. So, the objective is the restoration of the internal environment and thus providing those conditions essential for the recovery of the lesion stage in the patient. This is why the body adjustment is an essential integrative method and course of the osteopathic treatment. The key in osteopathy is found in the principle of adjustment, not correction, as there is not a question of a malposition, but one of altered physiological response. Osteopathy is not synonymous with manipulation. The osteopathic lesion is considered physiologically and not anatomical. And finally, long-term effects and stabilization of the patient can be gained more likely through the process of integration of the body. These fundamental principles represent the basis of the classical osteopathy of John Wernham. Of course, there might be limits to the scope of osteopathy, but the application of our philosophy and principles and techniques goes beyond the treatment of twisted bones and muscles. In all medical practices, both contemporary and throughout history of medicine, there has been controversy between philosophies and practice. If we compare the views of the ancient Greek pioneers of medicine, we come to realize even then the differences between the Hippocratic school of thought and the Cnidian school. The Hippocratic school was a model of medicine with a more patient-centered approach. It saw the good health of the patient as the key to prevent disease. In contrary to the Cnidian school, which understood disease as having an external origin, disease was seen as an invasion of pathogenic factors disturbing health, not very far off of what we see in our allopathic schools these days. So we see that osteopathy has gone through similar divisions of thought, in which different views have determined the development of the profession. This has led to various thoughts and concepts being added or discarded to the original principles of osteopathic practice. In classical osteopathic terms, it is not a question whether he or she is suitable for osteopathy, but rather what osteopathy can do for that patient at that particular time. And would like just to finish off with a few words.
There's a technique that is brilliant with that. For writing, it is undertaken practice in Jordan, as we have been laid down. And this is the identity we are trying to preserve. This is the ongoing which we keep alive at all costs. I remember the day that John giving the new graduates a pep talk for our own. We made them numbers going out and trying to practice. And then he said, all seriously, use your brain. Use your brain. And I want to repeat that this to you today with right dedication. Know yourself. And then you need their no man.
Thank you. Welcome to Maidstone. Thank you. Have a safe journey back home.